take your plate to the yard. You will eat with the dogs tonight, where a creature of your sort belongs. The great dining hall of Withen Court fell so silent that you could hear the candle flames lean and gutter, and at the long gleaming table, beneath the painted ceiling and the blaze of 100 wax lights, a young woman in a plain grey governess's gown rose slowly from the lowest seat, with her cheeks gone white, and her grey eyes very steady. Lady Sabine Withern, regal and terrible in violet silk and old diamonds, did not trouble to lower her voice, and the guests of 3 counties watched and tittered behind their fans as the girl lifted her plate in 2 trembling hands. Not one of them, not the smirking heir at the head of the board, not the great lady who had just cast her out, not a single jewelled mocker in that gilded room, had the faintest idea that the grey little governess they were driving out to eat among the hounds was the lawful, wedded Duchess of Withern, and that every stone of the house they sat in already belonged to her. She walked to the door with her plate held level and her head held high, and behind her the laughter rose, and not one of them knew that the wheel had already begun, very quietly, to turn. But before we go on, if your heart is already with that girl in the grey gown, take one moment now and subscribe to Whispers of Love, and tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight, and what hour it is where you sit. We read every one. Light a candle, settle in, and stay with us to the very end, because tonight's story is one you will carry with you long after the last word is spoken. Now let us go back, and let me tell you how a penniless governess came to be the secret mistress of the greatest house in the north, and how she came to be standing in that hall, holding her plate, while the proud laughed and the candles leaned. To understand that night, you must first understand the house, for Withern Court was not merely a house, but a kingdom unto itself, a vast pale palace of grey northern stone set high above its own valley, with 140 windows that caught the cold sun, and long terraces falling away in stone steps to gardens laid out like green embroidery, and beyond the gardens the deer park. And beyond the park the dark hanging woods, and beyond the woods mile upon mile in every direction, the farms and the villages and the moors that paid their rents to the Lord of Withern, and had done for 300 years. It was a house of marble halls and painted ceilings, of galleries hung with the portraits of dead dukes in armour and in ermine, of staircases wide enough to drive a carriage up, of a library with 10,000 books and a chapel with its own organ, and a dining hall where 40 might sit at meat beneath a ceiling on which some Italian master had painted the gods of old feasting among the clouds. And all of it, every acre and every stone and every painted god, had come down at last to one man, Adrian, the young Duke of Withern, who at the age of 30 stood alone at the head of all that splendour, with no living parent and no wife and no child, the last of his ancient line. He had not been bred to it. That was the thing the county never quite forgave him. Adrian had been a second son, the younger of 2 brothers, and had grown up knowing that the house and the title and the whole great inheritance would go to his elder brother Hugh, and so he had been left, as second sons are, to make his own way, and he had chosen the sea. He had gone into the navy as a boy of 14 and had served his country in cold far waters for the better part of 15 years, and had risen by his own courage and his own coolness to the command of a fighting ship, and had been, by every account, a hard and honest and capable officer, beloved of his men and feared by his enemies. With the weathered face and the level eyes and the plain straight manners of a man who has spent his life among ropes and storms and the deaths of friends, and not among drawing rooms. And then, in the space of a single dreadful winter, the elder brother Hugh and Hugh's only son had both been carried off by the same fever, within a month of each other. And the lightning of inheritance had struck where no one had ever looked for it to strike, and Adrian, the sailor, the second son, the man who had never expected to own more than his sword and his sea chest, had come home from the far side of the world to find himself, all at once, the Duke of Withern, and the master of that pale palace on the hill. He came home a stranger to his own greatness. He knew nothing of estates and rent rolls and the management of 1,000 dependent souls. He knew the discipline of a ship and the loyalty of plain men, and the difference between a true word and a false one, and not much else of the polished world he was now expected to rule. And into that ignorance, like a spider into an empty house, had moved his late father's sister, the Lady Sabine Withern. A widow of 60, childless, imperious, and very poor, who had spent her whole long life on the outermost edge of the family's wealth, eaten up with the conviction that she had been cheated of her proper share of it, and who saw in the arrival of this rough, untutored sailor duke the chance of her lifetime. She came to Withern, uninvited, to keep house for her bewildered nephew, and to teach him, as she said, how a great man ought to live. And she stayed, and she ruled. For Adrian, who could read a storm and a man's heart at a glance, was a child among the soft cruelties of the great world, and he let his aunt order his household and his table and his society because he had no notion how to do it himself, and because he was lonely, and because she was the only blood he had left. He did not see, for a long time, that Lady Sabine governed every hour of his life with one fixed and patient purpose, which was to make herself, in all but name, the true mistress of Withern, and to see that whatever the young Duke did, and above all whomever the young Duke married, served her ends, and not his own happiness. For Lady Sabine had a candidate ready. She had brought with her to Withern a young woman of her own choosing, a Miss Cordelia Vane, the daughter of a connection of her own, a great cold beauty of 22, with hair like dark gold, and a complexion like cream, and eyes of a hard pale blue that never warmed, who dressed magnificently and danced exquisitely, and had been trained from the cradle for one single purpose, which was to make a brilliant marriage and to bring her impoverished family back into the sun. Cordelia and her ambitious mother had fixed their whole hope upon the Duke of Withern, and Lady Sabine had promised them the match, and between the three of them, the aunt and the beauty and the beauty's mother, a quiet, relentless campaign had been laid to bring the lonely sailor to the altar. He was to marry Cordelia, and Cordelia was to be guided by her mother, and her mother was to be guided by Lady Sabine. And so the great wealth of Withern, which had fallen by accident into the hands of a man too plain and too honest to guard it, would flow at last, through this chain of grasping women, into the keeping of those who knew its proper value. That was the plan. And it would very likely have succeeded, for the Duke was lonely and the beauty was dazzling, had it not been for the arrival, one grey autumn, of a quite different young woman who came to Withern by the back door, on foot, with a single small trunk, to take up the humblest respectable post the great house had to offer. Her name was Lyra Merrow, and she came to be governess to the two small orphaned children of the late Duke Hugh's widowed steward, who lived in a wing of the great house, and whose little ones, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5, had been left motherless and wild, and were in want of teaching. Lyra was 23, the daughter of a poor country clergyman, now dead, a gentleman's daughter fallen on hard times, bred to books and music and the quiet virtues, and to nothing at all that could earn her bread save the teaching of other people's children. She was not a beauty in the way that Cordelia Vane was a beauty. She was slight and quiet and grave, of middle height, with a slender upright figure and a long, graceful neck, a pale heart-shaped face, a soft, serious mouth, and a wide, clear brow beneath smooth, dark brown hair, drawn back simply and without ornament. But she had a pair of large, calm, grey eyes, wide-set and steady and full of a deep, still light, that had a way of looking straight into a person and seeing the truth of them, and a low, gentle voice, and a manner so unfrightened and so kind that the two wild, grieving children loved her within a week, and would not be parted from her, and grew under her hand gentle and happy and good. She asked nothing of anyone. She kept to the schoolroom and the nursery wing and the long, quiet walks in the park with her two small charges, and she went about the great house like a shadow, unregarded, beneath the notice of the family and their grand guests, a grey little governess at £30 a year, the lowest of all the gentlefolk who ate beneath that painted roof. And it was on those long, quiet walks in the park that she first met the Duke. He had taken to walking out alone in the early mornings, before the house woke and his aunt could lay her schemes upon his day, walking far out across the dewy park and up into the hanging woods with a dog at his heel. A big, plain man in a worn seacoat, with his hands behind his back and his weathered face turned up to the sky. More at home among the trees and the wind than ever he was among his own marble halls. And one such morning he came upon the governess and her two children at the edge of the lake, where she was showing the little ones how a kingfisher hunts, kneeling in the wet grass with the children on either side of her, and her grey eyes alight with the simple joy of the thing. And the Duke, who had been lonely past all bearing in his own great house for a year, stopped and watched and was caught. For here, kneeling in the grass, was something he had not seen since he came home from the sea, which was a person being wholly herself, without calculation, without an eye to his title or his money, a person teaching two motherless children to love the world for the love of it. She did not know him. She had never seen the Duke. He kept apart. And she kept apart, and she took the big plain man in the worn coat for some upper servant or some plain living neighbour, and she spoke to him as one honest soul speaks to another, easily and without fear, and showed him the kingfisher's nest, and laughed at the children, and the Duke of Withen, who had been bowed and flattered and angled for and lied to by every soul in his own house for a 12-month, stood at the edge of his own lake, and felt, for the first time since he came ashore, that he was simply a man among honest people, and not a fortune to be hunted. He did not tell her who he was. It was the first true pleasure he had known in his inheritance, to be, for an hour in the early mornings, nobody, and he could not bear to give it up. And so morning after morning he came to the lake, plain Mr. Adrian, as he let her suppose him, the Duke's man of business or his distant cousin, she never rightly understood which. And morning after morning they talked, while the children fished and played, of books and of far countries and of the sea, of which he could tell such tales as held her breathless, and of God and of grief and of the small steady duties of a quiet life, and each of them found in the other the thing that neither had ever hoped to find in this world. He found a woman who saw him, the man, the lonely, weather-beaten, honest man, and not the Duke, and she found a man of such depth and such gentleness and such unfrightened goodness beneath his rough plainness that she came, before she had any notion of guarding her heart, to love him with her whole soul. And he loved her. He loved her as a drowning man loves the shore, with all the long-damned need of a starved and lonely life, and one grey morning by the lake, with the children calling far off across the water, he could keep his secret no longer. And he told her the truth. He told her that he was not the Duke's man, but the Duke himself, the master of all that great country, the loneliest man in 3 shires, and that he had loved her since the first morning by the lake, and that he wanted, more than he had ever wanted anything in his hard, adventurous life, to make her his wife. And Lyra, when she understood him, drew back from him white and trembling, not with joy, but with fear. For she was wise, and she knew the world. She knew exactly what it would mean for a penniless governess at £30 a year to marry the Duke of Withen. She knew that his great-aunt and all his great relations would call her an adventuress, a schemer, a low creature who had crept into the house by the back stair to trap a lonely man, and that they would never, never accept her, and that they would make it the whole business of their lives to break the marriage and to drive her out and to poison even his love against her in the end. She told him so, steadily, though it cost her more than he ever knew. She told him to forget the lake and the mornings and the grey governess, and to marry the great lady his aunt had chosen, and to be happy if he could. And Adrian, who had faced cannon fire without flinching, looked at her and told her, very quietly, that he had spent his whole life doing the hard right thing because it was right, and that he had come home from the sea to a house full of strangers who wanted nothing of him but his money, and that she was the one true thing in all of it, and that he would not. He could not give her up to live out his days as a rich and lonely ghost in his own halls. He asked her again to marry him. And then he told her the thing that decided it, the thing that showed her the true depth and cunning beneath his plain sailor's honesty. He had thought it all out, he said, as a sea captain thinks out a battle before it comes. He knew his aunt, he knew his world. He knew that if he married Lyra openly, in the chapel at Withern before all the county, his aunt and the Vanes and the whole grasping pack would fall upon the marriage and tear at it without ceasing, and would make Lyra's life a daily martyrdom, and might, in the end, by sheer relentless cruelty, succeed in poisoning what they had between them. And there was more. The Duke was a serving officer still. The long war was not yet ended, and at any hour the Admiralty might recall him to his ship, for they were short of experienced captains, and he had not yet been suffered to resign his commission. If he were called away to sea, and if he should fall there as sailors do, an open wife of a few weeks' standing, hated by all his family, would be left utterly at their mercy, alone and friendless in a hostile house, to be cheated and cast out the moment his back was turned or his eyes were closed. No, he would not have it so. He would marry her, truly and lawfully and at once, but he would marry her in secret, in a far quiet church, where no Withern eye could see, and he would draw up, with his own London lawyers, every paper and proof and settlement that the law could devise to make her safe past all unmaking, and he would lodge those proofs where no power on earth could reach them, and he would set it all in iron, so that whatever came, whether the Admiralty called him away or death itself, his wife and any child of theirs would stand upon a rock that all the malice of Withern could never wash from under her feet. And then, when the war was ended and his commission resigned and his own feet planted firm at last in his own house, he would bring her forth before them all, his lawful duchess, armoured in law, and let his aunt do her worst against a thing already done and proven and beyond all power to undo. So they were married on a still cold morning in the dead of winter, far from Withern, in a small grey ancient church in a market town where no soul knew either of their faces. Lyra Merrow and Adrian, Duke of Withern, were made man and wife by an old half-blind curate who asked no questions and entered their names fair and true in his register, with the Duke's own confidential lawyer and that lawyer's clerk for their only witnesses, all lawful, all binding, all sworn and sealed beyond any cavil of the law. And the Duke did all that he had promised. And more. He had his London lawyer, a shrewd and faithful man named Mr. Truscott, draw up a deed of settlement that bestowed upon Lyra, in her own absolute right, a great jointure charged upon the unentailed lands, and he made a new will, fresh and witnessed, leaving to his beloved wife Lyra, Duchess of Withen, the whole of his vast unentailed property, which was to say the very house of Withen itself and the bulk of all its lands, for his careful forefathers had broken the great house out of the old entail generations before, so that it passed not by blood but by the free gift of each duke in turn, and he lodged the marriage lines and the settlement and the will, all three, sealed and proved, in the strong room of his bank in London, in the keeping of Mr. Truscott, against the day they should be needed. And he gave to Lyra to keep secretly upon her person 3 things: a certified copy of the marriage register, folded small, the great Withern signet ring, heavy old gold graven with the leaping silver heart that was the crest of the house, which she was not to wear but to keep hidden against the hour of revelation, and a letter in his own hand, addressed to Mr. Truscott, charging that gentleman to render to the bearer every assistance, and to act in all things upon her word. And then Adrian brought his secret wife back to Withen, but not as his duchess. He brought her back the way she had gone, by the back door, on foot, with her small trunk, to take up again, in the eyes of all the world, her humble post as governess to the steward's 2 small children. It was a strange and a hard arrangement, and it asked of Lyra a patience and a courage that few could have borne. To live as a despised servant in the very house that was now, by law, her own, to be ordered and slighted and overlooked by the great-aunt who did not dream that the grey governess she scorned was the mistress of all she surveyed. But Lyra bore it, and bore it gladly, for the sake of the man she loved and the safety he had built for her, and for the stolen mornings by the lake that were now their married happiness, and for the long game they played together against the day of the great reckoning. By day she was Miss Merrow the governess, grave and quiet in her grey gown, teaching her 2 small charges in the schoolroom and walking with them in the park. And by night, by secret ways the Duke had shown her, through a hidden stair in the old wing that none but he now knew of, she went to her husband, and was for a few stolen hours the wife and the duchess that she truly was, and they were happy, deeply and quietly and completely happy, in the heart of that great hostile house, with their precious, dangerous secret held close between them like a lamp in cupped hands. But the war was not done with the Duke of Withen. They had been married scarcely 3 months, and that secret married happiness was scarcely begun, when the blow they had both feared fell upon them out of a clear sky. There came down from London, by a fast rider in the King's livery, an order from the Admiralty under the Great Seal, recalling Captain the Duke of Withern to immediate service, and appointing him to the command of a ship of the line then fitting out for a desperate and distant station, half the world away. The country was hard pressed, her best captains were few, and the Duke, for all his title, was a serving officer who had sworn an oath, and could not in honour refuse. He had perhaps a week before he must ride for the coast, and in that last terrible week, as they snatched what hours they could in the hidden room at the top of the old stair, Lyra told him a thing that turned his going from a grief into an agony. For she told him, low, with her grey eyes shining, and her hand pressed to her body, that she was with child. The Duke of Withern was to have an heir, and the Duke must sail to the far side of the world, and leave his secret wife, carrying his secret child, alone and unprotected, in a house that would hate her past all reason the moment her secret was known. He very nearly threw up his commission and his honour together, and refused to go. But Lyra would not let him. She would not be the cause of his disgrace. She would not have it said, ever, that the Duke of Withern had turned coward and abandoned his king and his ship for the sake of a woman. She told him, steadily, holding his weathered face in her two small hands, that she was stronger than he feared, that the law he had built around her was an armor no malice could pierce, that she would keep their secret and guard their child and hold their place in patience until he came home, and that he must go and do his duty and come back to her, and that she would be waiting, she and the child, when he did. And so the Duke, with a breaking heart, made his last dispositions. He could not now reveal the marriage himself, for there was no time, and to reveal it and then sail away and leave her would only fling her, defenceless and visibly hated, into the very jaws of his family. Better, far better, that she remain hidden, the unregarded governess, beneath their notice, and so beneath their malice, holding her secret and her strength in silence, until he came home to stand beside her, or until, if the worst befell, the time came to bring out the iron proofs that would right her past, all gainsaying. He left her money, secretly conveyed. He wrote a private letter to old Mr. Truscott, confirming everything and bidding him watch over her interests from afar. And he charged Lyra, last of all, that if word should ever come that he was dead, she was to go at once to no one in the house, but to ride straight for London and lay all before Mr. Truscott, who would see her righted. And then he held her for the last time in the cold grey dawn at the top of the hidden stair, and he kissed her, and he went down and out and away to his waiting ship and the far cruel sea. And Lyra Merrow, Duchess of Withern, watched the one light of her life ride away into the mist, and turned back, alone and with child and unknown, to play out her silent part in the great house of her enemies. The months that followed were the hardest of her life, and they tried her to the very bone. She kept her secret. She wound her plain grey gown a little looser, and pleaded a low fever for her pallor and her quiet, and went about the schoolroom and the park as before, the unregarded governess, while beneath the worn grey stuff her husband's child grew, and her husband's letters, when they came at all, came months stale by way of distant ports, and told only of storms and of far anchorages and of his unaltered love. And then, in the deep of the next winter, the letters stopped. Months went by, and no word came. And then there came, not a letter, but a paragraph in the London papers that an officer of the family carried up to Withern with a long face, that the Duke's ship had been spoken with off a far and stormy cape, sorely battered by a great gale, and had not since been heard of, and was feared, with all her company, to be lost. There was no certainty in it. Ships long given up for lost had been known to limp home a year later from the far side of the world. But there was no hope in it either that any common heart could see, and at Withern the family put on a decent show of mourning and behind their black gloves rejoiced. For if the Duke were truly dead, then the whole great inheritance, the house and the lands and the title, must fall, by the working of the entail and the law of blood, to the next male heir. And here was the very heart of the danger that Adrian, far away and now perhaps drowned, had foreseen and built so hard against. For there was a next male heir, and he was already in the house. His name was Sir Mordaunt Crane, a cousin of the Witherns in the male line, a man of some 35, sleek and handsome and cold, with smooth black hair and a soft, pale, clever face, and small, restless, dark eyes that were never still and never warm. Sir Mordaunt was deep in debt, deep in vice, and deep in the confidence of Lady Sabine, who had marked him long ago as her second string, the man who should have all if the sailor Duke should fail to wed and breed as she desired. He had come to Withern ostensibly to console his bereaved relations, and had stayed to take, with a smooth and hungry patience, the measure of all that might so soon be his. And with the Duke now given up for lost, Sir Mordaunt and Lady Sabine drew together over the spoils like two ravens over a fallen deer. Under the law, the bare title of Duke and the entailed core of the estate would pass to Sir Mordaunt as the next male heir, the moment the Duke's death was proved. But the great prize, the unentailed bulk, the very house of Withern and its richest lands did not pass by blood at all. It would go wherever the dead Duke's will should direct, and if, as all the family devoutly believed. The bachelor Duke had died intestate, having made no will. Then by the law it would tumble, with everything else, into the lap of his nearest of kin, which was to say into the joined and grasping hands of Sir Mordaunt Crane and Lady Sabine Withern. They did not know of any will. They did not know of any marriage. They did not know that the bachelor Duke they were so comfortably burying had left behind him a wife and an unborn child, and a strong room full of iron-proof 100 miles to the south. And they did not know, above all, that the despised grey governess in the nursery wing, the creature at £30 a year whom Lady Sabine had not addressed 3 times in 2 years, was the lawful Duchess of Withern, and that the child even now stirring beneath her plain grey gown was, if it were a boy, the true and rightful heir of all that they were dividing among themselves. They knew nothing. And in their ignorance, certain that the world was theirs, they began at once to behave as though it already were. Lady Sabine put off even the pretence of mourning within the month, and threw open the great house to all the county, and gave entertainment after entertainment in the dead Duke's hall, in part for her own pleasure, and in part to publish abroad, before all the world, the now settled match between her favourite, Miss Cordelia Vane, and the heir presumptive, Sir Mordaunt Crane, who, having lost the chance of the sailor Duke, had cheerfully transferred his courtship to the same cold golden beauty, so that the great fortune might be kept snug among themselves whichever way the law should jump. And it was at one of these great glittering entertainments, got up to honour the betrothal of Sir Mordaunt and Cordelia, and to celebrate, beneath a thin black veil of mourning, the family's coming greatness, that Lady Sabine Withern chose to take public notice for the first time in 2 years of the existence of the grey governess in the nursery wing. For Lyra, in those dreadful months of waiting, had made enemies without ever lifting her hand. She had made an enemy of Lady Sabine simply by being what she was, quiet and dignified and unafraid, for the old woman could not endure a dependent who did not cringe, and there was something in the governess's steady grey gaze, in the calm, unbroken carriage of her head, that affronted the great lady to her very soul, and that she could neither break nor understand. And Lyra had made a deadlier enemy still of Sir Mordaunt Crane, and in a far more dangerous way. For Sir Mordaunt, sleek and idle and ever on the hunt, had caught sight of the grey governess on the stairs and in the park, and had seen, where the great ladies saw only a drab servant, that Miss Merrow with her clear grey eyes and her quiet grace was the loveliest and the most truly well-bred woman in that whole gaudy house, and being a man who took what he wanted and was used to the easy conquest of dependent women, he had begun to pursue her, at first with oily compliments, and then, when those were met with a quiet, impassable coldness, with bolder and uglier advances. And Lyra, the secret wife of the lost Duke, carrying that Duke's child, had repulsed the heir presumptive of Withern with a quiet contempt that struck his vanity like a lash, and a man of Sir Mordaunt Crane's stamp does not forgive a poor woman who scorns him. He had complained of her, with smooth false words to Lady Sabine. He had hinted that the governess was insolent, was above herself, was perhaps no better than she should be, and Lady Sabine, who hated the girl already, had been only too willing to believe it, so that between the spite of the one and the lust turned malice of the other, a slow black resolve had formed in that great house to humble the grey governess, and to break her quiet pride, and at last to drive her out of doors. And the night of the great betrothal feast was the night they chose to do it. The great dining hall of Withern Court blazed that night with 300 candles, the long table loaded with silver and crystal and the white gleam of damask, and down both sides of it sat the flower of the county, sleek and bright and laughing, gathered to honour the betrothal of Sir Mordaunt Crane and Miss Cordelia Vane, and to do homage, though they did not say so, to the family that would soon hold all the country round in the hollow of its hand. At the head sat Lady Sabine in black and diamonds, gracious and terrible, queen of all she had stolen. At her right hand sat Sir Mordaunt, smooth and smiling, with Cordelia cold and golden beside him, and the wine went round, and the laughter rang against the high dark ceiling, and no one gave a single thought to the grey woman who had been bidden, against all custom, to bring the steward's 2 orphaned children down to make their bow, and who stood now in her plain grey gown in the shadow at the foot of the hall, a child by either hand. It was Lady Sabine who saw her, and the sight of that quiet figure standing unbowed in the shadow lit in the old woman's breast the slow black malice gathering there for 2 long years, and she set down her glass and lifted her voice so that it carried the whole length of the hall and stilled the laughter and turned every powdered head Miss Merrow. "Come forward, where the company can see you." And Lyra came forward, slow and steady, the 2 children clinging to her skirts, and stood in the great pool of candlelight, with every eye in the county upon her, and she did not flush, and did not tremble, but looked at Lady Sabine with her clear grey gaze, and waited. "I am told," said Lady Sabine, smiling round at her guests, "that our governess sets a great value upon herself, that she holds her head very high for a woman who eats our bread. I think it is time she learned her place." She let the silence stretch, and then pointed with one jewelled finger down the hall to the great doors, and beyond them to the cold, dark yard where the hounds were kennelled. "There is your table, Miss Merrow. Take your plate and go and eat it in the yard, with the dogs. That is where such proud charity creatures belong. Go." A gasp ran down the table, then a titter, then a swelling ripple of laughter, for the wine was in them, and the great were always glad to see the small abased, and the whole bright county laughed at the grey governess standing alone in the candlelight. And Lyra Merrow, Duchess of Withern, lawful mistress of that very hall and table, and the very bread upon it, and the roof above it, and the ground on which her tormentor sat, stood one long moment in the storm of their laughter, and felt beneath her shabby gown the small stir of her dead lord's child, and made her resolve. She did not weep. She did not plead. She did not so much as let her lip tremble. She gently loosed the 2 frightened children, and bade them go up to their nurse, and then, with the whole hall watching and laughing, she took up her plate in her 2 steady hands, and held it level, and turned, and with her head as high as ever queen carried crown, walked back down the whole long hall through the gauntlet of their laughter, and out through the great doors into the cold, dark yard. And the doors fell to behind her, and Lady Sabine, flushed with her triumph, took up her glass again, and the feast went on. In the cold of the yard, the hounds whining about her skirts in the dark, Lyra set the plate down, untouched upon the edge of the well, and looked up at the few hard stars over the black roofs of Withern, and did not weep even then. For something had hardened and settled in her that night that would not melt again, and she understood with a cold clearness that the hour her husband had foreseen and armed her against had come at last, and the time of silent waiting was over. She had borne it for the child's sake, and let them think her broken so they should not think her dangerous. But there are limits past which patience becomes not virtue but folly, and Lyra had reached them, and she was glad. She would write that very night, and send to London, and set the great slow machine that Adrian had built turning at last, and wait, with her terrible patience, for it to grind these laughing people into the dust. But the spider, who had tasted blood, was not content with one night's sport. Stung that even her cruelty had failed to break that quiet dignity, Lady Sabine resolved to be rid of the creature altogether, and in a way that should ruin her forever and turn her out without a character, to starve. And so there came a morning when Lyra was summoned to the great drawing-room, and found Lady Sabine waiting with a hard, bright look of triumph, and Sir Mordaunt lounging by the window with his cold smile, and the housekeeper stiff and unhappy by the door. And Lady Sabine held up, between finger and thumb, a brooch of diamonds, and said it had been missing from her jewel case these 3 days, and found that very hour wrapped in a handkerchief at the bottom of the governess's own work-basket, and that Miss Merrow was a common thief, and should be handed to the magistrate and transported beyond the seas, unless, the old woman's eyes glittering, she chose to go quietly that very hour, with no character and no wages, out of the gates of Withern for ever. It was a lie, root and branch, and Lyra knew the cold cleverness of it, for who in all that house would take the word of a charity governess against that of the great Lady Sabine? She stood very straight and very pale, and did not weep nor wring her hands, she said only, in a low, clear, steady voice, that she had never in her life touched anything that was not her own, that the brooch had been put in her basket by another hand, and that God and the truth would be her witnesses, though no one in that room would. And at that Lady Sabine laughed, and Sir Mordaunt by the window laughed softly too, and the thing seemed settled, and Lyra seemed lost. But old Mrs. Renton, the housekeeper, who had served at Withern 40 years and known the grey governess for a gentlewoman wronged, here found her courage, and spoke up trembling but plain, and said she would take her oath the brooch had not been in that basket the evening before, for she herself had tidied the schoolroom and seen it empty, and that someone had put it there in the night. It was a small thing, the word of one old servant, but it broke the smooth surface of the lie, and bought Lyra what she needed above all things in that hour, which was a little time. For Sir Mordaunt Crane, who had himself slipped the brooch into the basket at Lady Sabine's bidding, was not content to let the law do slowly what his own black appetite desired at once. That same evening, as the early dark came down, and Lyra was hastening along the cold stone passage to her little chamber, meaning to bar her door, and right through the night to Mr. Truscott, Sir Mordaunt stepped out of a doorway and barred her way. He had been drinking, his soft, pale face flushed and ugly, his small, dark eyes not still. He told her, in a low, thick voice, that she was a fool to stand on her pride, that the morning would see her thrown out a branded thief, to die in a ditch, and that there was yet one way to save herself, if she would but be kind to him. And he put out his hand, and took her by the arm, and drew her toward him into the dark. And Lyra, alone and unfriended, with the hand of her enemy upon her, and the child of her lost lord beneath her heart, felt a flash of pure cold fear, and then a blaze of pure cold anger, and she wrenched her arm free and struck him full across his sleek face with the flat of her hand, a ringing blow that staggered him, and told him in a voice low and shaking with fury that he might have her dragged to the gallows if he could, but that he should never, while she breathed, lay his hand upon her again. For she was a wedded wife and an honest woman and worth, gutter creature though they thought her, 1,000 such as he. The words leaped out before her caution could stop them, and struck Sir Mordaunt like cold water, and his flush died, and his small eyes went sharp and wary. For a wedded wife, he thought, to whom? And there was something in her face, some flash of a hidden power, that for half a heartbeat frightened even him. But the noise had carried, and there came the tread of feet and the swing of a lantern as old Mrs. Renton rounded the corner with a stout footman at her back, and Sir Mordaunt, with a snarl, turned on his heel and was gone into the dark, and Lyra was left trembling and saved against the cold stone, the old housekeeper's arm about her. That night Lyra did not sleep. Behind a barred door, by a single guttering candle, she wrote out the whole truth of her case, and folded with it the precious marriage copy and a tracing of the silver heart signet, and sealed the packet. And in the black hour before dawn, she gave it, with the last of her small store of money, into the hand of the one creature she could wholly trust, the steward's eldest boy, the orphan lad she had taught and loved these 2 years, who would have walked through fire at her bidding. She charged him to carry it on foot, by the byways to the Carrier's Inn 6 miles off, and there put it into the post for London with his own hands, and tell no living soul. And the boy, his jaw set and his eyes shining, took the packet inside his shirt and slipped out through the scullery in the grey dawn. And Lyra, watching from her high cold window as the small dark figure ran across the white frosted park toward the road to London and to justice, knew that she had loosed her arrow at last, and that there was nothing now to do but wait and endure and trust the dead man's foresight to bring it home. Far to the south, in his dusty chambers off a quiet London court, old Mr. Truscott broke the seal of that packet 4 days later, and read it through twice, and sat very still a long while with his old eyes wet, for he had loved the bluff sailor duke who had come to him with so wise a charge, and had kept the black tin strong-box locked in his innermost closet these 2 years with its weight of marriage lines and settlement and will, never knowing whether the day would come to open it. And now it had come. He did not delay an hour. He gathered his proofs, took counsel's opinion, and wrote letters that set wheels turning in the great offices of the law. And then he had the box corded and sealed, and ordered a post-chaise, and old as he was, Mr. Truscott set his face to the north and to Withern Court, to keep the charge his dead client had laid upon him, and see the wronged Duchess righted before the world. He came, as it fell out, in the very nick of time, for the family at Withern had at last grown bold enough to take the final step. The months had hardened into near certainty of the Duke's death, and Lady Sabine and Sir Mordaunt, impatient to clutch the whole great prize, and to silence forever the low murmurs creeping about the county that the bachelor Duke had perhaps not died so very bachelor after all, resolved upon a grand and public stroke. They would summon the whole county to Withern. The magistrates and the clergy and the great families and the lawyers of the district, to a formal and solemn declaration of the family's affairs, at which the Duke's death should be openly mourned, and Sir Mordaunt Crane openly installed as the heir, and every breath of rumour crushed beneath the weight of the county's witness. It was to be their coronation, and in their pride and their blindness they did not so much as think to be rid of the grey governess first. They left her in her nursery wing, despised and forgotten, never dreaming that she had been the one mortal danger to them all along. The great hall was filled again, but not now for feasting. The long table had been taken away, and rows of chairs set in its place. And on a dais sat the grave gentlemen of the law and 2 of the king's magistrates. the family papers laid out before them, and Lady Sabine in black triumph at the side, and Sir Mordaunt forward in his fine new mourning to be acknowledged, and all the county crowded the floor and the doors. And the senior lawyer had risen and begun in a dry grave voice to declare that the noble Duke being now beyond reasonable doubt deceased, and having died without issue and without will, the entailed honours descended to the next heir male, Sir Mordaunt Crane, and the unentailed residue likewise to him as nearest of kin, when there came a stir at the great doors, and the press of people parted. And there walked up the hall an old man in a snuff-coloured travelling coat, white-headed and dusty and stern, a black tin box carried before him by a clerk, and he came to the foot of the dais and said in a clear old voice that carried to every corner of the silenced hall, "I am Josiah Truscott, attorney at law, of London. I was the late Duke's confidential man of business. And before this assembly proceeds one word further, I must inform their worships that every word just spoken is false. The Duke did not die without a will, nor did he die a bachelor. The Duke of Withern was a married man, and left a lawful wife, and that wife stands within these walls at this hour." For a moment there was a silence so deep the fall of the fire embers could be heard, and then the hall broke into an uproar, a great surf of cries and starting up from chairs, and through it all Lady Sabine's voice rose shrill and furious, crying that it was a lie, a forgery, an impudent imposture, that there was no wife, no marriage, that this old fool was bought or mad. "Where is she?" she shrieked, on her feet now, white and shaking. "Where is this wife? Let the creature show herself." And into the ringing silence that followed, from the shadows at the foot of the great hall where the upper servants stood to watch their betters, a single grey figure stirred, and stepped out, and came forward. Lyra walked up the whole long length of that crowded hall, as she had once walked down it, with her plate held level, slow and straight and unhurried in her plain grey gown, with every eye in the county upon her, and a great rustling whisper following her like wind through corn, and she did not look at Lady Sabine, nor at Sir Mordaunt gone grey-faced and rigid by the dais, but came steadily to the foot of the dais and stood before the magistrates with her clear grey gaze level and calm. And then, slowly, she drew up from the breast of her gown, upon its worn ribbon, the thing she had carried hidden against her heart through 2 years of insult and waiting, and held it up into the light, a great signet ring of dark gold, graven deep with the silver heart of Withern. The ring that no hand but the Duke's own might wear, the ring he had set upon her finger in the far church and bidden her keep as her warrant. And at the sight of it a strange low sound went through the hall, for the older people knew that ring, and from the crowd an ancient bowed tenant, the oldest man on all the Withern lands, who had served 3 dukes and known the heart seal all his life, came tottering forward, leaning on his stick, peered at it close, and then drew back, and pulled off his hat, and bowed himself low to the ground before the grey governess, and said in his cracked old voice, loud in the hush, that is the Duke's own heart, "God save her grace." And one by one about the hall, the old tenants and servants who had known the seal uncovered their heads and bowed. Then the law took the matter in its slow, sure hands. Mr. Truscott opened the black tin box and laid upon the table the marriage lines fair and true, with the names and the witnesses and the parson's hand, and the settlement drawn tight in the Duke's behalf, and above all the will, signed and sealed and witnessed in due form, leaving the whole unentailed estate of Withern, the great house and the richest lands, freely and absolutely to his beloved wife Lyra, Duchess of Withern, and to the heirs of her body. The magistrates examined the papers long and gravely, compared the seals, questioned Mr. Truscott close, and could find no flaw in any of it. And at the last the senior magistrate rose and declared before the whole assembled county that the marriage was proved. The will was proved, and the woman before them in the grey gown was, beyond all doubt or cavil, the lawful Duchess of Withen and the mistress of that house, and all within it. And the county, that had laughed at her below the salt, rose to its feet as one, and bowed. But the law was not done, for Mr. Truscott had brought more than the marriage in his black box. While the hall still rang, the old lawyer turned to the magistrates with a graver face yet, and said there was a second and darker matter the King's justice must now hear. For Sir Mordaunt Crane, so certain of his coming greatness, had not waited even upon the law, these many months past, treating the estate as already his own. He had by forged authority and in collusion with a corrupt land agent been seizing the rents of Withern and selling its timber and plate and stripping its coffers into the bottomless pit of his own debts and vices, robbing an estate that was never his for a single hour. And here Mr. Truscott produced the falsified account books, and beside them, white and shaking, the very land agent himself, run to earth and frightened into confession, who now, to save his neck, told out the whole black tale of Sir Mordaunt's frauds and forgeries. The disgrace was utter. Sir Mordaunt Crane stood exposed before the whole county, not as the noble heir of Withern, but as a common thief and forger, a plunderer of an estate the law now declared had never been his at all, and the magistrates, then and there, ordered him taken into custody to answer for his crimes. The fall of the Ravens, when it came all together. Cordelia Vane and her hard, ambitious mother, who had clung to Sir Mordaunt only for his expectations, turned from him in his ruin without one backward look, and swept from the hall, their golden alliance shattered, to carry their cold beauty to some other and luckier market. Sir Mordaunt, his sleek face gone the colour of ash, was led away by the officers through the very county he had thought to lord it over, beggared by the restitution the law would wring from him to the last farthing, disgraced past all mending, to face his trial and after to slink abroad a ruined and friendless man. And Lady Sabine, the spider at the centre of the web, who had ordered the true Duchess of Withern to take her plate and eat with the dogs, sat frozen and grey amid the wreck of all her schemes, and as the full ruin of it broke upon her, that her power was gone, her favourite ruined, her stolen house lost for ever, and the very creature she had, abased below the salt now, her sovereign mistress, the old woman's hard, proud strength at last gave way, and she gave a broken cry and crumpled in her chair, brought down in a single hour from the height of her triumph to the very dust. And then, even as that judgment fell upon the proud, there came the last and greatest turn of all. For there was a stir again at the great doors, and the press of people parted, and the cold winter daylight fell upon a figure that no one in all that company had ever thought to see again upon this earth, a tall man, gaunt and weathered, brown as old leather with the sun of far cruel seas, his coat salt stained and travel-worn, leaning a little on a stick. Grey new come at his temples, and the marks of long hardship graven deep in his face, but his head held high, and his sea-grey eyes alight. A great murmur of disbelief ran through the hall, and someone cried out, for the older folk knew him through all the marks of his suffering. It was the Duke. It was Adrian himself, not drowned, not dead, but cast away these long months upon a far savage shore from a shipwreck that none had survived, but he and a handful of his men, given up by all the world, who had at last won his passage home, and come north as fast as horse could carry him to the wife he did not know whether he should find living or dead, and walked in upon the very hour of her vindication. For a moment the Duke stood in the doorway and looked down the length of his own hall, at the magistrates upon the dais, and the papers spread upon the table, and the broken old woman weeping in her chair, and then his eyes found, in the midst of it all, the one grey figure standing straight and pale, with the silver heart glinting upon her breast, and his weathered face broke and worked. And he came up that hall, not slow and stately, but fast, almost at a run, and the people fell back before him, and he caught Lyra in his 2 arms and held her hard against him. This man come back from the dead to the wife who had kept his faith and his name through 2 years of darkness. And when at last he held her a little off, he saw against the worn grey gown the small new shape of a child. For Lyra in the months of his absence had borne his son, and kept the boy hidden and safe as she had kept all the rest, the true and lawful heir of Withern. And Adrian looked upon his own face, given back to him small and new, and the strong worn man wept openly, and took the child up, and turned to the hall, and claimed them both before them all, his Duchess, and his son, and heir, in a voice gone hoarse and broken with joy. And he drew the silver heart signet from its ribbon, and set it once more upon her finger with his own hand, before the magistrates and the clergy and the assembled county, that there might never again be the smallest doubt of who she was. And the whole great company of Withern bowed down before their Duke come home and their Duchess vindicated, and the small heir held high in his father's hands. Now it would have been an easy thing for the new restored Duchess to deal out to her enemies the same hard measure they had dealt her, and there were those among the old servants who looked to see the proud Lady Sabine cast out that very hour into the winter roads with no more mercy than she had shown the governess she sent to the dogs. But Lyra was not made of the stuff of her enemies, and she had learned in her long abasement the thing the proud never learn, which is the worth of mercy. And when the broken old woman was brought trembling before her, expecting nothing but ruin, the Duchess said only that she would not do as had been done to her. She granted to Lady Sabine the use for her life of the quiet dower house at the edge of the park, with a decent income, on the single condition that she trouble Withern no more, and to be undone by mercy was the one stroke the hard old heart could not stand against. And Lady Sabine, who had wept no honest tear in 40 years, broke down before the woman she had wronged and wept, and was led away softened and humbled, and, in the end, the better for it. For there is a kind of forgiveness that wounds deeper than any vengeance, and heals what vengeance only hardens. And then began the mending of all that had been marred. The old pensioners turned off without bread in Lady Sabine's time were brought home, and their pensions restored. The village school let fall to ruin was reopened at the Duke's charge, the rack rents were rolled back, the cottages mended, and the old custom of the heart feast kept again, as it had not been kept for years, and this time no soul was sent to eat below the salt, for the Duchess would have every guest at her board, the highest and the lowest, served alike, with her own honour. The 2 orphan children of the dead steward, who had clung to Lyra through all her trouble, were raised as the Duke's own wards and loved. The faithful boy who had run with the letter to London grew up the trusted man of the house all his days. Old Mrs. Renton lived out her years honoured by the Duchess's own fireside, and old Mr. Truscott was rewarded past all his asking, and came north every summer to dandle the air upon his knee. And the small heir himself, the boy born in secret and in sorrow, grew straight and strong in the great house that was his by right, the dearest of all the proofs that truth, however long it is trodden down, comes up again at the last. And in the soft evenings of many summers after, when the great affairs of the day were done, the Duke and Duchess of Withern would walk out together, as they had walked when they were only Mr. Adrian and the grey governess and the world had not yet known them, down through the park to the still water of the lake where they had first met as honest equals and given each other their hearts before ever a word of rank or fortune passed between them. And there they would stand in the long gold light, with the water still as glass and the swans riding upon it, the man who had come back from the dead and the woman who had kept his faith through all, and look out over the wide, quiet lands of Withern that were theirs at last in love and in honour, and be at peace. For this is the truth that the proud forget and the patient prove, that the world, in its blindness, will seat the faithful below the salt, and bid the worthy eat with the dogs, and laugh to see goodness abased. But the world's table is a short one, and the world's judgment is a passing thing. And there is a longer table than the world's, where the last are set first, and the meek are crowned. And truth, that the powerful tread into the dust for a season, keeps its own long table, and seats there at the last every soul that kept faith in the dark. Lyra Merrow was made to eat with the dogs to be mocked, and she rose from the dog's yard a duchess, and her mockers ate the bread of her mercy all their days. Now I would dearly love to hear from you. If you had been Lyra, standing in that hall with the silver heart in your hand and your enemies before you, could you have shown the mercy she showed to Lady Sabine? Or would justice have had its full course? Tell me honestly in the comments below, and tell me too where in the world you are listening from tonight, for it always warms my heart to know. If this story of patience and faith and vindication moved you, do take a moment to subscribe and ring the bell so that you never miss the next tale we tell here, for there is always another story waiting, and another quiet soul who kept faith in the dark and was lifted up at the last. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for staying with me to the very end. Until next time, be gentle with one another, keep your faith though the world seat you low, and remember always that truth keeps a longer table than the proud will ever know.